For the majority of our history in public education in America, it has been quite a challenge to create this mentality of equity in the classroom. Now, what I mean by that is that, especially now for the increasingly growing population of ELL students in America, it has become necessary for our teachers to become more prepared and, in fact, to further their understanding of their students, especially as it pertains to English language learners. Uh, Culturally responsive teaching is something that I came across in very early in my credential program, and that it was something that I thought was interesting since the very beginning. Billings, Gloria Lawton Billings, who coined the idea in the first place, has shown that the research for culturally responsive teaching is a positive one. Even though her studies have been focused around African American students and their response to culturally responsive teaching, I think the research has shown that it can have many more applications to education, not only to include African American students, but also as it pertains to English language learners. Now, the significance of this study was something that I came up with in terms of connecting culturally responsive teaching to language identities and racial identities of ELL students. For most ELL students, even though the research shows that they do not necessarily or technically have to be immigrants, the majority of them, even if they are first, second, or third generation, have ties or are descendants of immigrant families, which is why the culture and language is completely different than what we would see inside the classroom, or even with the culture of the school as a whole, or even the culture of schooling and academia as a whole. What I wanted to focus on was the language and racial identities, because I feel like most of the research that I have looked through didn't really touch much on the connections between culturally responsive teaching and the language and racial identities of students. The reason why I think that's so important is because ELL students are either descendants or sometimes even immigrants themselves. It can create this cathartic issue or mentality of maybe the ELL student feels that he or she cannot be accepted by their own racial group, mainly because what I've seen, or what the research shows from the book called Teaching Boys and Young Men of Color by Dr. Luke Wood, it does illustrate the type of racial identity crisis that an ELL, not ELL, but called a student of color may have in creating this mentality of being good in school and being academically intellectual, and how that can create some cultural shaming from their own ethnic groups. But more importantly, the way that language can also create this identity crisis in terms of an ELL student being thrown into a culture and a language that they don't necessarily understand, and trying to connect that culture with their home culture and their home language. So I wanted this study to really focus on the aspect of cultural responsive teaching and how that would affect student identities in language and in racial connotations.